So I got a question, which was, can you give insight on the Bura civilization? And yes, I can. Even though I already talked about the civilization in the West African files, it is important to return to it. So I'm glad you asked the question. Although Mali has gone through several transformations, these houses represent the oldest styles found inside of this country. Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and so many more countries might be linked to this civilization. Its extremity is unknown, for culturally it is very similar to so many other West African kingdoms. Now, instead of going through areas, we have to first think about time. So, when did this culture exist? The answer to that question is very difficult because the starting dates seem to give a range between 1700 to 1400 BC, ever evolving after that, continuing their own culture. While some of the houses that we see are actually built in the modern world, they still arc back because we find foundations of these mud structures, and some of them even have borders around them made out of stone. And of course, stone represents another thing because this civilization is found by one thing that sophisticates it more than other kingdoms or other areas in Africa, and that is the Tumalus. Now remember, Tumalus are found all over West Africa. The three countries that exemplify this culture, although this culture might not be limited to these areas, is Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. Now, all the terracottas that I will show you, and terracottas are just a specific technique of clay to make a artistic impression. All of the terracottas that I will show you are found in the Bura archaeological site on the border of Niger, which is next to Burkina Faso and Mali. This is why this site is probably the one that we should start with, inside of Niger. Now remember, Niger is just above Nigeria. Nigeria has the oldest iron workings in history, and I've talked about them for many times. Some of them go back to 2000 BC. But is the Bura archaeological site older? The answer is no. What's fascinating about it is that the culture in Bura is very different than the culture in Nigeria. It means that under a short amount of time, the culture of ironworking, copperworking that moved from Nigeria to Niger had already made itself quite distinct from the rest of West Africa. Now, what do I mean? Well, let's take the terracottas themselves. Firstly, I've seen these styles before. These styles almost seem the same as those found in the later Ghana Empire. Now, I want to stress that all of these are from the Bura civilization, and they are from that one specific site. They are not from any other place, and they show the type of culture that existed. But these ones are from the 3rd century to the 11th century, meaning they are afterwards. Now, remember this cross type of thing that people wear in Africa. It's going to be handy later. Now, what exactly are these terracottas? Well, they're funerary terracotta. These funerary terracotta were found upside down. For some reason, the way they're put is upside down inside tumalus. Now, I understand the danger of talking about tumalus because I think a lot of people on my channel do not understand what a tumalu is. I want to remind you, a tumalu is a grave site, meaning there is something inside of these tumalus. It's not just a bunch of packed rocks and then we move on like, okay, thank you very much. Packed rocks exist in this area. And again, they might stretch as far culturally as Egypt and all the way to Ethiopia, Nigeria, and even North Africa. But if we just focus specifically on this area, these tumalus are actually very fascinating. And like I said, inside of these tumulus is where we find this culture. But remember, the culture is bigger than just grave sites. But that is the stuff that we have found, which shows its sophistication real early. So let's see what they look like inside. So these are the funerary mounds, and you will notice that they have a lot of similarities with other places. And you can see there the descriptions of the many things found inside of these tumulus. Things like bells, iron bells, by the way, disc ornaments, fragmented ornaments, rings made of copper, thumb rings, finger rings, all kinds of copper is found inside of this tumulu. This tumulu is from El Wadi inside of the Niger Mali area. Some of the terracotta that was found was in the form of animals, and these animals were mainly crocodiles. Now we must remember that these people worshipped animals and were part of animist cultures. We don't even need to know exactly how they worshipped it to know that this was true, as it's true in many places in Niger. If we want to know this fact, we have to go back, way back, 8,000 years ago back, so 6,000 BC. Whatever culture existed prior to this civilization invented some of the strangest dynamic art found, especially that of rock art. These giraffe are thought to be 6,000 BC, 8,000 years old. They look like something that was made yesterday. The true understanding and sophistication of this art tells you why this area would develop such great art in such an early time, which is why it does not surprise us that in later years we would find the type of culture that has the terracotta. Now, that terracotta is not completely new to West Africa because there are some in Nigeria, which we'll talk about in another time. So now that we understand the veneration of these people prior to this date, let us go back to this culture. So found still inside of Niger are people who still practice and make some of these artifacts. So inside of some of these tumulu, something that was found were stone bangles. These stone bangles almost reflect those found in France. Now, of course, this is just a coincidence. They have nothing to do with each other. But it does show that this culture has been surviving for thousands of years inside of Africa. These stone bangles, by the way, go back to thousands of years ago. What are we looking at here? Well, the image seen here shows that the culture is continuous. We are looking at a village with which has terracotta sculptures mounted on some of their clay houses, and you can see that it's a very complex form of house which has some rock, some clay, and some terracotta. One of the early people who investigated this place, Abdumaran Sindi, discovered that the culture that is being represented in those tumulus is still alive, although they don't practice the tumulu culture anymore. In other words, they don't bury people in tumulus. Those tumulus were only discovered because of the rocks. They are flattened today. In other words, they used to be mounded up on top of each other, but now they are flattened into the ground. And without those rocks there, they would have probably gone unnoticed. Written at the bottom there is rest shelter of the Habe village on the Bankasi plain, whose wooden pillars bear sculpture humans, figures, female breasts, footprints, etc. Now you might remember this shape when you see it. That is not a house, by the way. That is a granary. The granaries I've shown you in other parts is where they store grain, and it is decorated and used by these people. And again, this was the surprising part, that all of this culture existed and was being used by a tribe of people which we would call sophisticated today, but appears as if they are not to some people. The interesting part is that where they are located, there is no way they didn't run into people of other civilizations. So, how did they keep their former traditions? In what way did they serve themselves so that they did not have to change over the thousands of years? So, it's written at the bottom, croncrow or grain granary decorated in high relief with a human figure and a bird, the totemic animal of the tribe of the bird clan. Now, that is very interesting. Now, remember, in Africa, there are several types of animism. The first form of animism is pure veneration. So you venerate different types of animals. And then in the Mali sort of region, you have people like the Dogon who are separated into clans. So you have the leopard clan, the cheetah clan, the crocodile clan, and over here, these are the bird clan. Now, that is also very interesting because we see birds inside of those copper mounds or those tumalus, which have copper inside of them. Now, we all know that there is no time for waste within survival. And so we can tell that these people were thriving by this time, as we can see with these tumalus. There is no real struggle for these people that is outside of obviously all struggles that humans go through. These people have so much that they can bury the dead with some of the most valuable items that they have created. I mean, think about what I'm saying here: copper, iron, bells, rock rings that are etched out with some of these are just put inside of a grave, and the living have to continue. And you can see there that the person who's buried, there's a spear next to him. So there are lower artifacts. And this person was buried with a dog, which I assume was his dog. Maybe it was killed for the funeral, or maybe the dog had died long time ago and they saved it. I don't know. But he was buried with a dog. Now, it is possible, again, that it was more of an animism thing as a representative of what clan he belonged to. Now, this is very important when we talk about Africa. The clan thing is very, very important because it separates the religions of Africa from the Islamic culture that would come afterwards. And I want to stress this because a lot of these Tumalus, sometimes they come across as if it's something that happened after the Islamic invasion. No, they happened before. And we know this because the culture, the Islamic cultures that came afterwards, abandoned all of this. Now, this part is the research of Benoit Milly or Mill. This person has put together this map to indicate what happened after the Islamic times. So, in other words, there are some Muslims coming in this area, and it was this maps out the movements of Al Bakri. So you can see there El Waji right in the beginning, Jene Jano, Kumbi Salah, Tedigoost, Akchut, Porter, and all of these. And some of these areas that are located have gold in them, the ones with like the stars and stuff. So this is what happened afterwards. So if we can read there at the top, Trans-Saharan routes. So you can see these arrows showing routes of the Sahara. Now, the interesting thing about this is these routes might indicate a much more ancient thing, but let's pretend, as is thought, that they were completely isolated until the opening in the Kingdom of Ghana. You can see there the dotted lines, if you look at the top, the description, the dotted lines represent the limits of the Empire of Ghana, of ancient Ghana. So El Waji or El Walaji and Jene Jano just happened to fall in the influence of the Kingdom of Ghana, but not in the Kingdom of Ghana proper. The Kingdom of Ghana proper would be much smaller in that region. But in places like Gao and places like that, we do see the great influence of the Kingdom of Ghana. So this culture that existed in its time also arcs back to the Kingdom of Ghana. So the limits of the Empire of Mali, 13th century to the 15th century, you can see there as well. And again, remember, this is over 1,000 years after some of these ironworks, copperworks, terracottas were already found. And then you can see location of grid deposit, Upper Niger and Senegal, Bore and Bambouk, Black Volta description, Eastern Burkina Faso, and Western Niger. Then directions of gold trade is those little things there. You can see under the stars. In order to see them, again, look at the very top corner first, start there, and you will see words. See there, right at the bottom, depictions of gold trade. Now look down to the very bottom of the page, the very bottom, the things that look like suns, incomplete suns, those are the gold areas. So you can see there, Niger and close to Nigeria, Benin, Burkina Faso, Guinea, all of those areas have gold, and gold must have been discovered as early as all the other iron and copper and other metals. And I think that's why gold is not as seen as this great material at the time, because unlike the other civilizations, Egypt and all of those, gold was discovered at the same time as all the other metals, and all the other metals were just as precious, and gold was not rare in these cultures. So if it's not rare, it was discovered at the same time, and there's other metals that are rare. Clearly, they're going to think that those metals are better. If you then go to places like the Swahili coast, or you go to places like Great Zimbabwe or Mapungubwe, you see there that they value gold, but that's because of trade. So I talked about the fact that these guys know or still know how to manufacture rock bracelets or rock circles, which they make and wear as ornaments, rock ornaments, which are cylindrical, which again, they were found in France, but the French people have no idea how to create them since they're so ancient to France. And so they came to Africa to come and view how these people make them. Firstly, dig up the prehistoric bracelets that exist, and this is one of the missions that exist. And this is one of those made of stone. Now, again, if you look at it, you go, okay, I don't know how exactly they could make that. That's the problem. Luckily for them, people still were making these in Africa, in Mali, in that same Niger Mali region. But you must admit, this is a lot of work for some funerals. These people, since we find these mainly at funerals, must have had way more sophisticated civilizations outside of their funerals, outside of their burials. And of course, even though this arcs to their religion, it arcs more to the religious side dealing with the dead. What about the living? What exactly can we gather from these? Well, the cool thing is that these images, even though they were found in grave sites, still show us how the people were treated. For example, you can see scarification, wedding rings around the necks, spoons, and here's my favorite one, horses. The person depicted here is seen with the same exact culture as the rest, except that he is riding a horse. So you can see there's scarification on his head. Scarification, very typical of the culture. It doesn't just represent scarification, it also represents healing, power, strength, and remember, Africans also believe that to remove certain diseases, you'd have to cut yourself. Cutting is very important. Then you can see that he's got that weird cross thing on the stomach. That has been seen from the kingdom of Bornu, Nigeria. All of those places have that. And I've shown you many times. But the fact that he has a horse tells you that horses existed within this region. Now, they were not very typical, but they existed in this region. This person is probably regal, and that is probably why he has this. Now, the money that is available within this kingdom probably shocked everybody. It is no surprise that the kingdom of Ghana came up inside of this area. Why would anybody be surprised at all? Now, you cannot live where you bury the dead. And so we know that these people lived very far away. Now, remember, like I said, these people lived in stone houses, the same that you would see in the kingdom of Ghana later, and the same that you would see in the kingdom of Mali and other kingdoms in West Africa. So we read from UNESCO: necropolis sites proper characterized by a particular type of coffin jars or anthropomorphic funerary urns composed of pottery surmounted by statuette heads placed upside down on the ground and containing human skeletons at Asinda Sika, which is the site where we found all of those terracottas that I was showing you. Every image that I showed you is from Asinda Sika. These sites comprise two very distinct archaeological levels: sites of religious altars and ritual ceremonies characterized by piles of large blocks of stone form a kind of flattened tumulus or espelendes, as at Asinda Sika, Keri Tondi, Jeje Tondi, and Mebera Tondi. There are found fragments of tripod vase feet and fragments of pottery in the form of small painted cylinders. Now, separate that. That is the funerary side of it. And like I said, you can't live on a gravesite. That doesn't make any sense. The stones that are used in the gravesite are used for tumulus, which show human occupation. It shows human movement. It shows that these people went and fetched large stones from someplace and moved them into one location. Second, dwelling sites. These are different than the necropolis sites where people are dead. Dwelling sites that are difficult to identify, but the discovery of fragments of tripod vases and sometimes a few small piles and alignments of large stone blocks testify to a human presence. Also, on the site, we find quartzite or flint debitage waste representing the arrowhead and thin ceramic site of Cosendo Gorizo, located to the west of the necropolis behind a hill. Stones that we find from around the 3rd century to the 13th century also indicate that this civilization was using stone. But I want to talk about something much deeper than this, and I will talk about it in another video, not now, as we are finishing this video. It's the Tishit culture. See, the Tishit culture that is located on the other side of this kingdom still remains with its prehistoric stoneworks and stone walls that were made around 1500 BC. It's not difficult to imagine that since they exist in the same general area, that this is what the kingdom looked like, as we know that in the Tishid region, they have very similar terracotta to that found in that region. And also in Nigeria, there is another culture as well that goes back years and years that has the same depictions. So to finish off, let's understand timelines. So the Tishit culture, which is has nothing to do with this culture, by the way, it's on Mauritania and that whole side, very far away from this location. It's about 2000 BC all the way till about the 3rd century. The culture in this area, so in the Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso area, again, distinct from the Ghana culture, distinct from all of these, is from the 3rd century to about the 11th century. This kingdom is very distinct. And of course, the kingdom of Ghana came after this kingdom or this line of civilizations around the 8th century. All of this tells us that these distinct cultures probably had networks connecting one another, and they are true African civilizations, as there is, according to archaeologists, researchers, the Greeks, a lot of people, there seems to be a moment where there was very little communication between the Sahara and this area down at the bottom. Now, again, they might have a general culture that is similar, but that would be a guess at this point. What we do know is that these people independently created some of the greatest civilizations, and Nigeria is still one of those areas that needs to be investigated. And I'll look into the Tishit culture next. Like, share, subscribe. Don't be scared to ask questions. Sometimes they can lead to a very interesting video. I will link some of my older West African videos, but I think because the microphone was way worse in the past, that I should redo all of them. If you agree with this, give a like. Thank you very much. Oh, and don't forget to donate if you can. Any amount will help. I don't care how small it is, it just helps. Thank you very much.